The moment Clara Bailey walked into the general store in Dusty Creek, Texas, in the spring of 1882, she knew the day was going to be trouble, because Harold Finch was already waiting by the door with his hat pressed to his chest, and that particular expression on his face that meant he was about to say something she absolutely did not want to hear. Dusty Creek was the kind of town that had grown up fast, the way most Texas towns did in the years following the war, with rough-hewn buildings pressed together along a single main street, a water tower that leaned slightly to the east, and a population of men who outnumbered women by a margin so wide that a single woman walking to the mercantile could gather 3 marriage proposals before she reached the counter. Clara Bailey was 24 years old, sensible-boned, and possessed of dark auburn hair she wore in a practical braid down her back. She had inherited her father's land 6 months ago when he passed of a fever, and she had been running the small cattle operation on the edge of town with the help of 2 aging ranch hands ever since. She was not looking for a husband. She had never been particularly looking for a husband. She was looking for flour, coffee, and a replacement axle pin for the wagon, and Harold Finch was blocking the door. "Miss Bailey," Harold said, and already his voice had that trembling, hopeful quality that made Clara's jaw tighten. Harold was not a bad man. He ran the feed store and he paid his debts on time, and he sang in the church choir with genuine enthusiasm. But he had proposed to Clara on 4 separate occasions over the past 5 months, and each refusal seemed only to embolden him further, as though he had concluded she simply had not yet understood the depth of his sincerity. "Good morning, Harold," she said evenly, trying to angle past him. He stepped sideways to block her. "I was hoping we might speak this morning. I have a great deal to accomplish before noon. It won't take but a moment. I've given this considerable thought." He straightened to his full height, which was not considerable, and Clara saw him draw a breath. "Miss Bailey, I believe we would make an excellent match. My feed store is profitable. My house has 3 rooms. Harold," she said, with patience she did not entirely feel, "I am grateful for your kind regard. I truly am, but my answer has not changed." He looked crestfallen in the specific way of a man who truly could not fathom why his inventory of virtues had failed to close the transaction. Clara stepped around him, pushed through the door of the general store, and immediately encountered George Prout leaning on the counter with a speculative expression that told her he too had been waiting. "Miss Bailey," George began. "Not today, George," she said, and moved directly to the back of the store where Ada Simmons, the shopkeeper's wife, was stacking tins of peaches. Ada, who was 43 and had seen everything twice, looked at Clara with a mixture of sympathy and amusement. "That's 2 before 10 o'clock, she observed. "It was 4 yesterday," Clara said, pressing her fingers to her temples. "I cannot walk to the well without someone asking for my hand. My father has been gone 6 months, and every bachelor in 3 counties has apparently decided that my grief is an appropriate moment to present his case." Ada shook her head. "It's the land, honey. You've got 140 acres and nobody to work it but old Pete and his bad knee. Men see a woman alone on good land and they see opportunity." "I see it too," Clara said darkly. "That's why I find it so tiresome." She collected her supplies, paid Ada, and was navigating the boardwalk back toward her wagon when she came face to face with Theodore Marsh, who was the worst of them, because Theodore Marsh was persistent and had a temper that ran close to the surface, and on 2 occasions he had made remarks that were not quite threats but that sat in the stomach like a cold stone. Theodore was thick-necked and prosperous, running the largest cattle operation in the county, and he had the easy arrogance of a man who had never truly been told no about anything that mattered to him. "Miss Bailey," he said, and did not bother with the hat gesture or the trembling voice. His proposal, when he delivered it, was less a question than a statement of intention. "I'd like you to give my offer serious consideration. The Bailey land adjoins mine on the south pasture, and a business arrangement of this nature makes sense for everyone." "A business arrangement," Clara said. You know what I mean." "I know exactly what you mean," she said. "And the answer is no, Mr. Marsh. It will continue to be no." His expression did not become threatening precisely, but it hardened in a way that reminded her of stone walls. "You might find your situation growing difficult, Miss Bailey, without the right friends in this county." She met his eyes and held them, because she had learned that looking away from Theodore Marsh was never the right choice. Then she stepped around him without another word and walked toward her wagon, her heart beating faster than she would have liked, because whatever she had shown on the outside, the inside of her was genuinely worried. It was as she was untying her horse from the hitching post that she heard a low voice from her left, unhurried and slightly rough at the edges, the way a voice gets when it spends more time outdoors than in. "That man trouble for you." She turned. Leaning against the post of the saddle shop was a man she did not recognize, which was notable in a town small enough that she knew most faces by sight. He was tall, lean-built the way men who work cattle tend to be, dressed in worn canvas trousers and a faded blue shirt, with a battered hat pulled low over dark eyes and a jaw that carried 2 days of not shaving. He was not especially remarkable to look at, except that he had the kind of stillness that either meant great patience or great danger, and something in the set of his shoulders suggested the former. "Nothing I cannot manage," she said. "Yes, ma'am, you looked like you had it well in hand," he agreed, and there was something in his tone that was not quite teasing and not quite respectful and somehow sat directly between the two. "Charles Bristol. I've just hired on at the Hennessy spread north of town." "Clara Bailey," she said. "My land is south." "Bailey," he repeated. "Jim Bailey's daughter," she blinked. "You knew my father, passed through this country about 8 years back. He was a fair man, bought me a meal when I was trail-worn and didn't have 2 coins to argue with each other." He said it simply, without sentiment, as though he was reporting a fact he wanted on record. "I was sorry to hear he passed." Clara looked at him for a moment longer than was strictly proper. "Thank you," she said. "That is kind." He touched the brim of his hat, straightened from the post, and began to move off toward the saddle shop. She watched him go and then climbed onto her wagon seat and picked up the reins, and tried to push the morning's accumulation of unwanted attention from her mind. She did not manage it. All the way home, bouncing along the rutted track that led south to the Bailey property, she thought about Theodore Marsh's expression and the cold stone feeling in her stomach. She thought about how it would be 5 proposals next week and 6 the week after, and that she had no legal mechanism to stop it, and that her 2 ranch hands, Pete and his cousin Rufus, while loyal and hardworking, were not exactly positioned to lend her the kind of social shield that would discourage men like Theodore. What she needed, she thought, was for the town to believe she was already spoken for. Not married, not yet, but spoken for, because the rules of this time and this place were very clear on that point. A woman being courted by a man was not approachable by another. She had no man courting her. She had the opposite problem entirely. She put the horse up in the barn, took the supplies inside the small house, and stood in the middle of the kitchen that still smelled faintly of her father's pipe tobacco, and thought about Charles Bristol leaning against that post with his unhurried voice and his dark eyes and his easy stillness. She told herself it was a practical thought. It was, in fact, as practical as anything she had ever thought in her life. The following Thursday was market day in Dusty Creek, which meant Clara had a legitimate reason to be in town, and she arrived early enough that the street was not yet crowded. She found Charles Bristol at the livery stable, helping the Hennessy hands load a wagon with fence posts, and she waited at a polite distance until he noticed her and walked over, pulling off his work gloves. "Miss Bailey," he said. "Mr. Bristol." She had rehearsed this several times in the solitude of her kitchen, and she had concluded that directness was the only reasonable approach, because any softening of what she was about to propose would make it sound like something it was not. "I have a request that is somewhat unusual, and I want to be clear from the outset about exactly what it is and what it is not." He tilted his head slightly, which she took as permission to continue. You will have noticed, perhaps, that the unmarried men of this town are persistent in their attentions toward me, she said. I've noticed, he said. One of them in particular, Theodore Marsh, is the kind of persistent that carries an edge, she said. I am concerned that my refusals will eventually provoke him into making things difficult for me. The most effective way to discourage him and the others is for the town to believe that I am already being courted. She paused, measured his expression, and found nothing she could read clearly. I am asking whether you would be willing to pretend to court me, publicly. Walk with me on Sundays, sit with me at church, bring me a flower occasionally, that sort of thing. Long enough for the proposals to stop and for the town's attention to move elsewhere. He was quiet for a long moment. A horse shifted in the stable behind him. Somewhere down the street, someone was hammering. And when the proposals stopped, he said, we would conclude the arrangement quietly. You would perhaps indicate that things had not worked out between us, and I would be left in peace without the additional complication of suitors. And you'd have me in mind for this because you are new to town and therefore unburdened by existing social entanglements that might make it complicated, she said. Because you appear to be a man of straightforward character, and because you knew my father, which means I am not asking a complete stranger. He looked at her for a long moment with those dark eyes that were difficult to read, and then one corner of his mouth moved in what was not quite a smile. That's a lot of practical thinking for a Thursday morning. I am a practical woman, she said. I can see that. He turned his hat in his hands once and then looked back at her. All right, Miss Bailey, I'll do it. She had not entirely expected agreement, and so she stood for a moment without her next sentence ready. I appreciate it, she said finally. Just tell me what you need, he said simply, and went back to the fence posts. The first public appearance was that same Sunday at the small white-painted church on the east end of Main Street. Charles Bristol arrived 5 minutes before the service, hat in hand, and sat beside Clara in the third pew from the front, which was where her family had always sat. He was dressed better than she had seen him yet, in a clean dark shirt and trousers that had been pressed, and his hair was combed back with the effort of a man who had taken the request seriously. The effect on the congregation was immediate and visible. Clara felt the small vibrations of attention ripple through the wooden pews around them the way you feel a stone land in still water, the turning of heads, the small murmured consultations. She kept her eyes on Reverend Clemens and her hands folded in her lap, and beside her Charles Bristol sat with his shoulders squared and his hat on his knee and looked equally forward. When the service concluded and they filed out into the bright morning, Harold Finch gave Charles a long measuring look and said nothing to Clara at all. George Prout found somewhere else to be entirely. Even Theodore Marsh, standing in a group of ranchers near the steps, watched them with a narrowed assessment that Clara felt between her shoulder blades but made no move to approach. That went better than I expected, she said quietly as Charles walked with her toward her wagon. Small towns pay attention, he said. Is this terribly inconvenient for you, she asked. Your actual work, I mean. Sunday mornings aren't working time, he said, and church is church. He helped her up onto the wagon seat with a hand that was entirely straightforward about it. Just the practical business of assisting someone up a step, and yet the touch of his palm against her gloved hand left her slightly more aware of her own hand than she had been before. She drove home with the morning feeling lighter than it had in months. The arrangement, as she had described it to him, was church on Sundays and a brief walk through town on Thursday market days, and perhaps occasionally a flower, though she had suggested that without entirely expecting him to produce one. On the following Thursday, he was waiting at the edge of the market square with a bunch of Indian paintbrush, the vivid orange-red wildflower that grew in the rocky ground along the creek south of town. It was such a bright, unapologetic handful of color that she laughed, which surprised both of them. You actually got flowers, she said. You said flowers, he said, without apology, and held them out. She took them and they walked through the market together, and he carried her basket without being asked when it grew heavy, and they stopped at Ada Simmons's fabric stall, where Ada gave Clara a smile of absolutely transparent delight and shook Charles's hand with both of hers. "Any man who brings Clara Bailey flowers deserves to be welcomed to this town properly," Ada said, and Charles accepted this with a nod and the same unhurried quality that seemed to be his natural state. The proposals, as the weeks passed, did indeed slow and then stop. Harold Finch turned his attention toward the new schoolteacher who had arrived from Austin, a development Clara thought was a genuine improvement for everyone involved, including the schoolteacher, who seemed to find Harold's earnestness charming. George Prout moved on without comment. Even Theodore Marsh, while he never became warm toward Clara, at least ceased to position himself in her path with that cold stone quality of intention. The practical problem was solving itself exactly as Clara had designed it to solve. The unanticipated problem was Charles Bristol himself. He was, she discovered over those weeks, not simply a convenient prop in her arrangement. He had opinions about cattle grazing patterns and told her, when she mentioned a problem she was having with her south pasture, that she was grazing it too early in the season and needed to let the grass come up another 3 weeks before she turned the herd onto it. He was right, and she knew he was right, and she felt a small irritation at this followed by a larger appreciation, because good advice about her land was not something she had easy access to. He fixed the leaning fence post at the corner of her east field one Saturday morning when he came to walk her to the church social the following day, and when she expressed surprise, he said simply, "It was leaning," as though this explained everything, which in a sense it did. He told her when she asked about his history that he had grown up in Missouri and had been working cattle since he was 17, moving from ranch to ranch across Texas, Kansas, and once up into Colorado. He was 28 years old. He had no family left to speak of. He had a horse named McCready, a roan that he had bought off a bankrupt rancher in Abilene 2 years ago, and that horse he spoke about with more obvious affection than anything else he mentioned. "You love that horse better than most people, I think," she said one Thursday, when McCready had done something particularly intelligent about a gate that needed opening. "Most people," he said with that not-quite smile, "are harder work than a good horse." "And what am I?" she asked before she had entirely thought about whether that was the right question. He looked at her sidelong. "You're different work," he said. She could not tell from those 3 words whether that was a compliment or an observation, and she turned the question over in her mind for 2 days afterward, which told her something about her own situation that she found inconvenient to acknowledge. The day things shifted was a Saturday in July when the summer heat was at its most determined, pressing down on Dusty Creek like a flat iron on cloth. Clara had ridden out to check the water levels in the creek that ran along the eastern edge of her property, because the dry spell had been worrying her, and she found Charles there already, sitting on the bank with his boots off and his feet in the water, eating an apple with the philosophical enjoyment of a man who has found precisely the right place to be. She pulled up her horse and looked at him. He looked back at her. He was on the Hennessy property boundary, technically, but the creek ran between the 2 properties and this bank was ambiguous territory. "You know," she said, "this creek runs through my land." "It does," he agreed, "and this bank is the Hennessy side by about 4 feet. She dismounted and tied her horse to the creek willow and sat on the bank 3 feet from him, because the creek bank was genuinely pleasant and the shade was real, and she had ridden out in the heat and could not pretend she did not want to sit down. She took her own boots off because the water looked too cool and inviting for pretending otherwise, and she put her feet in beside his without comment, and they sat there for a while in silence, which was a comfortable silence of the kind that takes time to build. "Can I ask you something?" she said eventually. "You can try," he said. "Do you find this arrangement strange?" He considered this with the same seriousness he seemed to bring to most things. "Strange how?" "We have constructed a false courtship for the benefit of the town," she said, And we have now been doing it for 6 weeks, and the proposals have stopped, and the original problem is largely solved. And yet here we are sitting on a creek bank on a Saturday when there is no one in town to see us, which means we are not here for the benefit of the arrangement." He looked at the water. "No," he said, "we're not." The simplicity of that admission sat between them in the summer air. A red-winged blackbird landed in the willows 20 yards downstream and sang 3 notes and flew away. "I find," she said carefully, "that I look forward to Thursdays. I find," he said, equally carefully, "that the week gets longer before them." She turned to look at him. He was still looking at the water, and the afternoon light was on the side of his face, and she was aware, with a sudden clarity that was almost physical, that she had stopped thinking of him as a convenient arrangement somewhere in the past 2 weeks, without noticing the exact moment of the transition. "Charles," she said. "Clara," he said, and that was the first time he had used her given name, and it changed the weight of everything. They looked at each other across the short space of the bank, and neither of them said anything more, and the creek moved past their feet with the cool indifference of water, and it was enough, for that afternoon, to sit there and let things be what they were becoming. Except that things are never quite that simple, and Dusty Creek was too small a town for anything to develop in privacy. The following Sunday, when they arrived at church together as had become their habit, Clara noticed something new in Ada Simmons's expression. It was no longer simple delight at a clever social arrangement. It had deepened into something genuine, the look of a woman who has watched 2 people over several weeks and seen something real growing that the 2 people themselves have not yet fully admitted to. "You're good for each other," Ada said to Clara, at the social hour after service while Charles was across the room talking to Reverend Clemens about something practical, a fence, or a water barrel, or the kind of useful matter that men of Charles's disposition gravitated toward. "It's not," Clara began. "I know what you told me at the start," Ada said, "and I'm telling you what I see now. You can see it too, if you're not working too hard at not seeing it." Clara watched Charles across the room, the way he stood, easy and present, the way he listened to whatever Reverend Clemens was saying with genuine attention. She watched the way he glanced across the room and found her without apparent effort, the way his eyes stayed on her face for just a moment longer than checking a room requires. "It's complicated," she said. "It's not as complicated as you're making it," Ada said, and went to refill the lemonade. The complication, as Clara understood it, was this. She had asked Charles to play a role for practical purposes, and she had been very clear and businesslike about it, and he had agreed in exactly the same spirit, and now she was uncertain whether what was growing between them was genuine on both sides or whether she was, on her side, simply becoming confused between the arrangement and the reality. She was also uncertain whether he felt anything beyond a friendly regard, because Charles Bristol was a man who communicated in understatement, and whose deepest feelings were expressed in the fixing of fence posts and the delivery of wildflowers, and she was not entirely confident she was reading those signals correctly. What she needed, she thought, was information. What she got instead was a crisis. It came in the form of Theodore Marsh, who arrived at her property on a Wednesday morning in late July with 3 of his ranch hands and a surveyor named Galloway. Clara came out onto her porch to find them in her yard with a surveying chain and a tripod, and her blood went cold. "What is this?" she said. Theodore Marsh looked up at her from under his hat brim with the expression of a man who has decided that patience is no longer required. "There's a question about the southern boundary of your property," he said. "Galloway here is going to establish the true line." "There is no question about my boundary," she said. "My father had it surveyed in 1874, and the documents are recorded at the county courthouse." "Documents can be imprecise," Marsh said. "And an unmarried woman running this land alone with no legal advisor might find herself in a difficult position if the line comes out differently than she expects." It was the most naked threat he had yet delivered, and it was naked enough that Clara felt the cold in her stomach and the heat in her face at the same time. She was also, for the first time in 6 months, genuinely frightened, because Theodore Marsh had money and legal connections that she did not, and frontier justice in 1882 did not always fall neatly on the side of right. "Get off my property," she said. He did not move. "Miss Bailey," the lady said, "get off her property." The voice came from behind her, and she turned to see Charles Bristol walking around the corner of the house from the direction of the barn, and he was moving with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who has decided where he is going, and he was looking at Theodore Marsh with those dark eyes that were currently communicating a clarity of intention that made even Marsh's expression shift slightly. "Bristol," Marsh said, "this doesn't concern you." "It concerns me," Charles said, stopping on the ground below the porch steps, positioning himself between Clara and the men in the yard with the simple geometry of someone who has made a decision. "Miss Bailey has told you to leave. The surveyor's equipment can go back in the wagon and you can take yourself and your men off this land." There was a long moment. One of Marsh's ranch hands, a big-shouldered man named Cole, shifted his weight. Charles did not shift anything. "You're a hired hand on the Hennessy spread," Marsh said. "You have no standing here." "I don't need standing," Charles said. "I need you to leave." It was not a threat. It was not loud. It was simply a statement of how things were going to be, delivered by someone who gave every impression of knowing how to make sure of it. Theodore Marsh was not, fundamentally, a brave man. He was a man who used power when he had it clearly established, and right now the calculation was uncertain enough to make retreat a reasonable option. He jerked his chin at the surveyor, turned, and walked his horse out of the yard with the stiff-backed dignity of a man, intending this to be a delay rather than a surrender. Clara stood on the porch until the dust had settled, and then sat down abruptly on the top step, because her knees were not entirely reliable. Charles came and sat beside her on the step, not touching her, just sitting there in companionable proximity. "Where did you come from?" she said. "Came to borrow your post-hole digger," he said. "Pete told me yesterday you had one." "You came to borrow a post-hole digger and ended up facing down Theodore Marsh." "Thursday's market day tomorrow," he said. "I'll borrow it then." She laughed, which was not the response she had expected from herself, and it came out slightly ragged around the edges, which told her exactly how frightened she had actually been. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth for a moment, composing herself, and Charles sat beside her and waited. "I should go to the county courthouse and verify my documents are in order," she said when she had composed herself, "in case he pursues this legally." "That's the right move," he said, "and I should perhaps speak to someone with legal knowledge. There's a lawyer in San Marcos." "I can ride with you," he said. She looked at him. "That's a day and a half each way." "I know it," he said. "You would take 3 days from your work for this." He looked back at her with those eyes that were currently doing something complicated she was only beginning to know how to read. "Clara," he said, which was the second time he had used her name, and it had the same weight as before. "Yes." She nodded, and they made plans, and it was only later, much later, lying awake in the dark of her father's house listening to the summer insects, that she acknowledged to herself that a man who was pretending to court her would not have stood between her and Theodore Marsh's surveyors. A man who was pretending would not ride 3 days for a document verification. She was not quite ready yet to say what she thought this meant, but she was very close. They left for San Marcos on a Friday morning, Clara on her bay mare and Charles on Macready, with a bedroll each and enough food for the trail. It was proper enough, just barely, for her to make this trip with him, and she had told Pete and Rufus where she was going and asked Pete's wife, Nance, to come stay at the property while she was away. The town would notice and draw conclusions, and she found she had stopped minding what the town concluded. The ride to San Marcos took them south through Limestone Hill country, that was one of the genuinely beautiful parts of Texas, all cedar and live oak, and the silver glitter of creeks running over flat rock in the afternoon sun. Charles knew the country and told her where the best water was, and they made camp the first night in a cedar grove above a clear spring, with a small fire and the stars overhead in the manner they get in that part of Texas in summer, which is to say overwhelming, as though the sky has let down all its reserves. Clara sat across the fire from Charles and looked at the stars and thought about practical things, the lawyer's office, the documents, the boundary survey, and then stopped thinking about practical things and looked at him instead. He was watching the fire the way he watched most things, with full attention and without apparent necessity to fill the silence. He had his hat off and his dark hair was loose and the firelight was on the planes of his face, and she thought, with a directness that surprised her, that he was a genuinely handsome man, and she had been looking at him for nearly 2 months and had been arranging not to acknowledge this. "Charles," he said, not looking up from the fire, "when the proposal stopped, I did not come to you to end the arrangement." He looked up then. The fire moved between them. "No," he said, "you didn't." "I should have," she said. "That was the original intention." "Yes," he said. "I did not come to you because I did not want to end it," she said. The fire popped. McCready shifted on his picket line behind them. "I know," Charles said. "Do you—" She started again because she was a practical woman and practical women do not speak in half sentences. "Do you want to end it?" He looked at her across the fire for a long moment and she held his gaze, and then he said, "No, Clara, I don't want to end it." "What do you want?" she said. He stood up from his side of the fire and walked around it and sat down beside her in the cedar-scented dark, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him distinct from the warmth of the fire, and he said, "I want to court you. Actually court you. If that's all right with you." She looked at his face in the firelight and thought about all the practical reasons she had constructed against feeling what she was feeling, and found they were not, in this moment, adequate to the task. "That is all right with me," she said. He reached across and took her hand, and held it in both of his, and that was all in the respectability of an 1882 Texas night with the stars overhead and the fire between them and the cedar wood smelling green and honest, and it was more than enough. In San Marcos the following morning, they went to the office of a lawyer named Howard Beck, who was a dry-mannered man with a genuine command of land law, and Clara laid out the situation with the clarity she brought to everything. Beck reviewed the original survey documents she had brought and confirmed what she had believed. The Bailey property boundary was correctly recorded and could not be disputed by a secondary survey without a formal legal challenge that would be expensive and difficult to win given the recorded documentation. "Your boundary is solid," Beck said. "Marsh would be fighting uphill all the way." "Would you be willing to put that in writing?" Charles said. "I can write a letter summarizing the legal position, yes," Beck said, "for my standard fee." Clara paid the fee from the household account with the satisfaction of a woman who has handled something correctly. Outside on the San Marcos street, she looked at Charles with something that was half relief and half triumph. "Theodore Marsh is going to be very disappointed," she said. "Good," Charles said simply. They had a meal at a small restaurant near the courthouse, a proper sit-down meal at a table with a cloth on it, and Clara had coffee and Charles had coffee, and they talked, not about the land or the law or the arrangement or anything practical, but simply about things. What she had wanted to be when she was a child, which was an astronomer, which made him laugh. What he remembered about Missouri, which was mostly the cold of the winters and the particular blue of the sky in autumn. Whether she found the hill country beautiful or only useful, to which she said both, and he agreed that was the right answer. It was the most natural conversation she had ever had with a man, was what she thought, and she had it without an agenda or a performance or a worry about what was being communicated, and at the end of it she looked across the table at him and thought, with the clarity that comes when you stop arguing with yourself, "I love this man." She did not say it at the restaurant, but she thought it, and knew it was true, and knew also that it had been true for some time, and that she had simply been unwilling to look directly at it. The ride home was different from the ride out. The way return journeys are always different because the destination is known, and the tension of the new is gone, and what remains is simply the pleasure of the country and the company. They rode side by side rather than one behind the other the way the trail width had required in places on the way down, and they talked easily and occasionally fell into comfortable silence. And once Charles reached across and tucked a loose strand of her hair back from her face where the wind had pulled it, with a gentleness so matter-of-fact that she felt it in her chest for an hour afterward. They arrived back in Dusty Creek on Sunday evening, and the town, which pays attention as Charles had said, noticed. The letter from Howard Beck arrived at Clara's property by post 3 days after they returned, and Clara made a copy of the relevant sections, wrote a brief and entirely professional letter to Theodore Marsh, and sent both the copy and the letter to him by way of the post office. She also sent the original documents back to the county courthouse with a formal request that they be additionally annotated with Beck's legal assessment, which Beck had indicated was possible and advisable. She did not hear from Theodore Marsh directly. She heard through Ada Simmons, who heard through Reverend Clemens, who heard through the county clerk, that Marsh had consulted his own legal man and been advised that the Bailey property boundary was indeed incontestable. The cold stone feeling in her stomach, which had been her companion since that conversation on the boardwalk months ago, finally and definitively dissolved. Charles came to Sunday church and to Thursday market as he had been doing, but now without the structure of the arrangement around it, just a man who came to see a woman he was genuinely courting, and the difference was visible to anyone who looked, which in Dusty Creek meant everyone. Ada looked at Clara with the satisfied expression of someone whose assessment has been confirmed by events. "I told you," Ada said. "You told me," Clara agreed. "Does he know?" Ada asked. "Know what?" Ada gave her the look of a woman who is too gracious to say the obvious thing aloud and went back to her fabric. One Thursday in August, Charles asked if he could come to supper on Saturday. She said yes, and spent most of Friday thinking about what to cook, which was not like her, because she had been cooking for herself for years and had never found it a matter of significant concern before. She settled on a roast chicken and made bread in the morning, which the heat did not recommend but which she made anyway because her father had always loved fresh bread, and the recipe was in her hands the way certain things get. Charles arrived at 6 and brought a jar of honey someone had given him at the Hennessy Ranch, which made her laugh again because it was such an unpretentious gift, just honey, because he had it and thought she might like it. They ate at the kitchen table and afterward sat on the porch in the cooling evening and watched the western sky go from orange to crimson to a deep bruised purple as the sun went down behind the hills, and Clara told him about her father, about what he had been like in the evenings, sitting in this same spot, and how much she missed him. She had not told anyone else this, had kept the grief private in the way that grief sometimes needs to be private before it can be spoken, and she found that Charles listened to it the way he listened to most things, with full attention, and without the discomfort that makes some people hurry grief toward its conclusion. "He sounds like a man worth missing," Charles said. "He was," she said. A whippoorwill started up in the cedar down by the creek, that liquid insistent call that always sounds like longing to her, and she listened to it in the dark and felt both the grief and something alongside the grief that was not its opposite but its companion, a warmth that had not been there before. Charles turned to her on the porch, and in the dark she could see the shape of him and the lighter pale of his face, and he said, very quietly, "I am not pretending, Clara. I want you to know that. Whatever this started as, it has not been pretending for me for a very long time." She turned to face him fully. "Since when?" she asked because she was a practical woman and wanted to know. He thought about it with genuine seriousness. "The creek bank," he said. "The Saturday in July. Before that, I think, if I'm honest about it." "The paintbrush flowers," she said. He paused. "Earlier than that," he said, and his voice had a quality in it she had not heard before, something undefended. "The first Thursday in the market when you laughed at the flowers. I had not expected that. I had expected you to thank me politely." She looked at him in the dark. "Why did you get the flowers if you only expected a polite thank you?" "Because I wanted to make you laugh," he said simply. "I just didn't know it until you did." She reached across in the dark and took his hand the way he had taken hers at the fire, and he closed his fingers around hers. And they sat there on her father's porch in the Texas dark with the whippoorwill calling and the last of the summer heat rising off the earth. And Clara Bailey said, quietly and without preamble, "I love you, Charles." He was very still for a moment. Then he said, in a voice that had roughened slightly, "I love you, Clara." He paused. "I have been trying to find the right moment to say it. I have been apparently worse at finding the right moment than I thought." "This is the right moment," she said. "Yes," he said, "it is." He raised her hand and pressed his lips to the back of it, which was such a quiet and old-fashioned gesture that it felt exactly right for the porch and the dark and the whippoorwill and the whole of the evening. And she felt it in the same place in her chest where she had felt the warmth rising. And she knew she was not confused and had not been confused and had, in fact, been remarkably clear for a long time. In September, Charles came to her on a Thursday with no wildflowers and no basket carrying, just himself standing on her porch in the clean morning light, turning his hat in his hands with an expression she had not seen from him before, which was something close to nervous, and Charles Bristol was not a man she associated with nervousness. "I want to ask you something," he said. "All right," she said, standing in the doorway. He looked at her steadily. "I want to ask you to marry me. Not as an arrangement, not for the benefit of the town. Because you are the most sensible and honest and surprising person I have found in 10 years of traveling this country, and I do not want to travel any further without you." She stood in the doorway with the morning light coming over his shoulder and the sound of Pete and Rufus working somewhere behind the barn, and felt the full weight of the moment settle over her, which was not an uncomfortable weight but a clarifying one. "You said surprising," she said. "You laugh when you don't expect to," he said. "You argue with Creek Banks about property boundaries. You rode to San Marcos with a hired hand and made it look like common sense." The not-quite smile was present. "You're surprising." She came out onto the porch and stood in front of him, and she said, "Yes, Charles, I will marry you." He let out a breath that told her the nervousness had been genuine, and she felt a deep affection for him that was partly because he had been nervous and had asked anyway, which is the thing that matters. He took her face in his hands, careful hands that were rough from work and gentle in their intention, and kissed her, which was proper enough on her own porch on a Thursday morning in 1882 Texas for a couple who were engaged. And it was the kind of kiss that does not announce itself loudly, but that establishes a truth that will not be revisited. They married in October, when the Texas heat had finally relented, and the sky had gone to that clear deep autumn blue that Charles had mentioned in San Marcos, the blue that had stayed with him from Missouri all these years. Reverend Clemens performed the service in the white-painted church, and Ada Simmons was Clara's witness, and the Hennessy brothers, who had come to respect Charles greatly over the months he had worked for them, attended in their good shirts. Pete and Nance and Rufus sat in the front pew, and Pete cried quietly, which he would deny for years afterward. Clara wore her mother's dress, which she had taken in at the waist and let out at the shoulders, and had flowers in her hair that were not Indian paintbrush because the season was wrong, but that Ada had arranged with the late autumn wildflowers, goldenrod and purple sage and the last of the white asters, and she carried a small bunch of them going up the aisle. Charles was already standing at the front when she walked in, dressed in the best clothes he owned, which he had supplemented with a new white shirt from the general store, and he was looking at her with those dark eyes that she knew now as well as she knew the layout of her own pastures, and what was in them was not complicated. It was simply and completely what she had always wanted to see in a person's eyes looking at her. Someone seeing her, the actual her, and finding everything there that they needed. The ceremony was brief because Reverend Clemens understood that the substantial things had already been settled, and his job was merely to make them official. When Clemens said the words, and Charles slid a simple ring of hammered silver onto her finger, which he had made in San Marcos at a silversmith's shop while she was talking to the lawyer, and she understood that he had been planning that, had been hoping that far back in July. She felt both the surprise and the recognition that comes when you see that something you thought was new has actually been present for a long time. After the ceremony, there was a supper at the church hall that the town contributed to in the way of small towns everywhere, each household sending its contribution of food, and the result being both excessive and delicious. And there was a fiddle and a guitar, and dancing on the board floor that had been cleared of the long tables. And Clara danced with Charles and with Pete and with Reverend Clemens, and Charles danced with Ada and with Nance and once, under Ada's pointed direction, even with Harold Finch's new wife, the schoolteacher from Austin, who had married Harold in September and who seemed to have found his earnestness entirely endearing. At the end of the evening, Clara stood in the doorway of the church hall with Charles beside her and looked at the autumn night in the main street of Dusty Creek and thought about the morning in April when she had walked into the general store with Harold Finch blocking the door and the cold stone feeling in her stomach. "Do you know," she said, "it has been less than 6 months since I asked a stranger to pretend to court me." He looked down at her. "I know. And now we are married." "We are," he said. "You were supposed to stop," she said. "When the proposals stopped, you were supposed to stop the courtship and let it conclude quietly." "I forgot," he said, and the not-quite smile was at its fullest, which meant the corner of his mouth was definitely moved and the eyes were definitely doing something that was unmistakably warm. "You forgot," she repeated. "Or I didn't try very hard to remember," he said. "Charles Bristol," she said. "Clara Bristol," he said, and it was the first time he had used her new name, and she felt it settle around her like something put on that had always been meant to fit. They walked out into the October night together, her arm through his, under the sky that was full of stars in the way that Texas sky always is, as though it cannot help but be excessive about it. And they went home to the Bailey property that was now also the Bristol property, which still smelled faintly of her father's pipe tobacco, and now also, she had noticed, of cedar and horse, and the particular outdoors smell that was Charles. The first year of their marriage was the education in each other that every first year of marriage is, the discovery of habits and preferences and tender spots and reliable certainties. Clara learned that Charles was impossible to wake with noise, but would come immediately alert if anything happened with the horses or the cattle, some deep wire in him that monitored the animals even through sleep. Charles learned that Clara could argue with a problem for 2 solid days before she would accept a solution that was not her own idea, and that the best approach was to make his solution sound like her own idea, which required a subtlety he found he was willing to develop because the outcome was worth it. They worked the land together. Charles had a rancher's instincts that complemented Clara's more administrative approach to the property, and together they did things with the Bailey land that Clara's father had wanted to do, but had never quite had the resources or energy to accomplish. They drilled a second well on the north pasture, which made the spring grazing rotation more efficient. They rebuilt the barn roof before winter arrived. They negotiated, on very favorable terms, a grazing lease with a neighboring property that brought in additional income without requiring additional labor. Theodore Marsh, for his part, had apparently concluded that his position was not improving and had turned his attention toward a property dispute with a rancher on his northern boundary, which occupied him sufficiently that the Bristols were left in peace. He was not a reformed man or a pleasant one, but he had correctly assessed that the legal and social math no longer favored him, and he was nothing if not a man who understood calculation. In the spring of 1883, Clara told Charles one evening that she was expecting a child. She told him directly because she was not a woman who built toward announcements, and his response was to sit very still for a moment and then pull her into his arms with a gentleness and a firmness simultaneously that said everything he was not immediately finding words for. When words came, they were characteristic. "We should fix the spare room," he said. She laughed into his shoulder. "Yes," she said, "we should." The spare room got fixed, which in practice meant Charles and Pete working for a week and a half to repair the rotting floorboards and repaint the walls and install a new window that actually shut properly when the wind came from the north. Nance contributed a quilt she had been making for 15 years and had never found the right purpose for. And Ada Simmons appeared one afternoon with fabric for curtains and her own sewing basket, and sewed them at Clara's kitchen table, in an afternoon of the particular comfortable domesticity that only women who know each other well can produce. The child arrived in November of 1883, and was a boy, which Charles received with the same stillness that was his response to everything that genuinely moved him, the stillness of a man who knows that words are insufficient and does not bother to produce inadequate ones. He held the baby with the careful attention of someone learning a new and precise skill, and the baby looked up at him with the unfocused gravity of the very new, and Charles said, "Hello," to him in a quiet voice, as though they were simply meeting, which in all the essential ways they were. They named him James for Clara's father. James Bristol grew into the property and the family the way children do in that country, made of the land he could see from every window. He was 3 years old when he first sat on Macready, with Charles's hand steadying him, and the expression on his face was not fear but intense concentration, the look of a child who has immediately understood that this is important and intends to take it seriously. Clara watched them from the porch rail and felt the complex layering of happiness, the particular kind that includes a thread of the person who is not there, her father, who would have loved this, who would have sat in his rocking chair and watched his grandson on a horse with the same quiet satisfaction with which he had watched most things that were good. "He's got good hands," Charles said, looking up at her from where he stood beside Macready. "He has your hands," she said. Charles looked at his own hands as though this were new information. "Better than mine when I was 3, he said. "You cannot possibly remember your hands when you were 3, she said. "No," he agreed. "But I remember not being good at anything." He lifted James down and set him on the ground, and James ran directly toward the house and his lunch with the total commitment of a small person with priorities, and Charles came up the porch steps and leaned on the rail beside her. "I was a late starter," he said. "And now you have a ranch and a son and a wife in Macready," she said. He looked sideways at her. "In that order. Macready was clearly mentioned last," she said. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and the afternoon went about its business around them, the way Texas afternoons do, big and unhurried and full of light. In 1885, their daughter arrived, which they were not expecting to happen quite so quickly after the news became apparent, but which the doctor in San Marcos, who was now their regular physician given the relationship established during the legal visit, indicated was simply the way of things. They named her Eleanor, which had been Charles's mother's name, a woman Clara would never meet but about whom Charles had told her enough to know she had been worth naming someone after. Eleanor was, from the beginning, the loudest and most opinionated person in the Bristol household, which was a field with some competition. She had Clara's auburn hair and Charles's dark eyes, a combination that would in time be genuinely striking, and she had opinions about her food and her blanket and the arrangement of her world that she communicated with a directness that her mother found entirely familiar. "She is a Bailey," Pete told Charles with great authority, watching Eleanor reject a perfectly adequate bowl of porridge with maximum expressiveness. "She's both," Charles said, removing the porridge from Eleanor's reach with the efficiency of a man who has learned which battles are worth running. James, at 3½ regarded his sister with the cautious assessment of someone who has had his world rearranged and is deciding whether the new arrangement is acceptable. He decided, after approximately 2 weeks, that it was, and thereafter was devoted to her in the particular way of older brothers who would never admit to it, but whose behavior makes it entirely clear. The Bailey property thrived. By 1886 they had increased the herd, improved the fencing throughout, and added a second barn that was large enough to store hay through even the worst Texas winters. Charles had become, in the 4 years since he had arrived in Dusty Creek as a stranger leaning against a saddle shop post, one of the county's respected ranchers, not because he had sought that position, but because the county had noticed that his work was consistent and his word was reliable, and his wife was the kind of woman that other women trusted, which in any community is a significant social asset. He still brought her flowers. Not on a schedule or as a requirement, but occasionally, when he rode past a stand of something that was blooming in a way that struck him, he would stop and pull a handful and bring it home and set it in the blue pitcher on the kitchen table. The gesture was so continuous with who he was by now that the flowers themselves had become a kind of language between them, not elaborate or considered, just the expression of a habit of attention. One Thursday in the autumn of 1886, Clara walked through the market in Dusty Creek with a leaner on her hip and James running ahead of her at the edge of leash distance that 5-year-olds consider ideal, and she passed the place where she had first properly spoken to Charles, the saddle shop post where he had leaned with his unhurried voice and asked if Theodore Marsh was trouble for her. The saddle shop was still there. The post was still there. The market was the same market, with Ada's fabric stall and the smell of fresh bread from the bakery that had opened 2 years ago, and the sound of the blacksmith working behind the main street. Charles came up beside her, having collected their purchases from the general store, and she stopped and looked at the post. "You know," he said, "you asked me if he was trouble for me, right there, and I said nothing I cannot manage." "I remember," he said. "I was not entirely truthful," she said. "I know," he said. "That's why I stayed close." She looked at him. He was looking at the post with the same dark eyes, the same still quality, older now by 4 years, with the addition of a small scar on his jaw from a fence post incident in 1884, and the deepened lines around his eyes from years of the Texas sun, and he was as recognizable to her as her own reflection, as the layout of the Bailey pastures, as the way the whippoorwill sounds in the cedar by the creek at dusk. "Thank you," she said, "for forgetting to stop." He looked at her, and the not-quite smile was at its most present, the one she had been the beneficiary of for 4 years now, and that still did the same thing to her that it had done that first Thursday in the market. "Thank you for asking," he said. A leaner, being a leaner, chose this moment to demand to be put down and then to make directly for the closest interesting thing, which was a display of tin pots outside the general store, and James pursued her with the serious authority of an older brother, and the moment dissolved into the ordinary cheerful business of a family on a market Thursday, which is to say the best kind of ordinary. That winter, the worst cold snap in a decade came down from the north, and the Bristols spent 3 days moving cattle to shelter, and keeping the water troughs from freezing and feeding the animals from the hay stores they had put up in the new barn. It was hard, unglamorous work done in conditions that made everything harder, and Clara and Charles worked it together without complaint, Clara managing the cattle records and hay distribution, while Charles and Pete and Rufus dealt with the physical demands of the frozen ground and the wind. On the 3rd night, when the temperature had finally shown signs of rising and the worst was evidently past, they sat together at the kitchen table in the lamplight with mugs of coffee, both of them tired in a way that goes below the bones, and Charles looked across the table at her and said, "You are the best partner I have ever had in any work." It was such an honest and uncalculated compliment that she felt it more than she would have felt something more elaborate, because it came from a man who meant exactly what he said and never inflated it. "You're not bad yourself," she said. He smiled, which was the full version, both corners, which he produced less frequently and which she prized accordingly. In 1887, They had a second son, whom they named Robert, for no better reason than that they both liked it, and it suited the baby, who arrived with a calm disposition that was quite unlike Aliner's introduction to the world, and that would turn out to be characteristic. Robert was the child who watched everything before he acted on it, who learned to walk later than James had but never fell, who would sit at the edge of activity observing until he had satisfied himself of the pattern, and then participate with an efficiency that made adults feel he had been doing it for years. James, by 1887, was 4 years old and the leader of the junior contingent of the Bailey Bristol property, conducting operations in the yard and barn with an authority that the chickens and the dog and occasionally Aliner mostly respected. He was already riding Macready alone in the yard, Charles walking alongside, and the horse, which had an excellent instinct for human competence, was tolerably respectful of the small rider who had clear and confident hands. Clara watched her children grow up in the particular way that mothers watch children, with a double vision that sees both the child in front of her and the infant behind her, and she felt the full weight of what had come from one practical request made of a stranger on a Thursday morning in April 1882. She had wanted the proposals to stop. She had gotten something so far beyond what she had asked for that it made the original request seem almost comically small, like asking for a candle and receiving the sun. She told Ada this one afternoon in 1887, in Ada's kitchen over coffee, while Robert slept in his basket and Aliner played with Ada's cat in the corner, and Ada listened with the expression of someone to whom none of this is a surprise. "I told you," Ada said, for what must have been the 15th time since this conversation had begun 4 years ago. "You told me," Clara said. "You were lucky he was leaning against that post," Ada said. "I was lucky he had known my father," Clara said. "And that my father was worth knowing," Ada nodded. "Jim Bailey was a good man. He would have liked Charles." "He would have loved him," Clara said, and found that she could say this now without the grief overriding the warmth, which was not that the grief was gone but that it had found its place alongside the rest of things, which is what grief does when you give it enough time and company. In the years that followed, the Bristol property continued to grow, not dramatically or recklessly but steadily, the way good things grow when tended with consistency. They added a summer kitchen when the heat made cooking in the house unbearable. They built a proper schoolroom at the back of the property for the children, because the town school was 2 miles distant, and Nance, who had once been a schoolteacher before she married Pete, offered to teach the Bristol children in exchange for the use of the room on weekday mornings. This arrangement turned out to serve several neighboring families' children as well, and became in time a small but genuine educational institution. James Bristol, growing up in that schoolroom under Nance's instruction, turned out to have a mathematical gift that neither of his parents had predicted, and that made Charles very quietly proud in the way that surprises in children tend to make parents proud, because it is evidence of a new person rather than simply a reflection of themselves. Aliner, by the time she was 6, was obviously her father's daughter in the ways that matter about work. She would attempt anything, she would not give up on anything, and she had a preference for the outdoors and the animals that she made no effort to conceal. She also had, very clearly, her mother's gift for direct speech and the practical management of problems. Robert remained Robert, observant, efficient, and faintly amused by the energy of his siblings, which he regarded with the philosopher's detachment of a man who has already determined that the shouting will resolve itself without his intervention. In 1889, Theodore Marsh finally sold his property and moved to San Antonio, which the county received with a general sense of relief that was too polite to state aloud, but that was visible in the slightly lightened atmosphere of the next town meeting. His property was bought by a family named Galvez, who were quietly competent ranchers and good neighbors, and with whom the Bristols quickly established the easy rapport of people who share a boundary and a sensibility. Charles told Clara the news about Marsh over supper, and Clara received it with a mild nod that indicated she was pleased and no longer required to think about it. "He was never going to be a problem again," Charles said. "I know," she said, "but it is still better." "Yes," he said. "It is." After supper she sat on the porch in the evening, which was still her favorite part of the day, the cooling air and the particular quality of the Texas dusk, and Charles came and sat beside her, and they listened to the sounds of the property settling into the evening, the cattle moving on the night pasture, the horses quiet in the barn, the children's voices through the open window. James arguing with Alina about something that required volume and Alina arguing back with the equal commitment she brought to everything. "Do you regret anything?" she asked him. She did not specify the range of her question because she trusted him to understand it. He thought about it, which was what she had expected because he did not give unconsidered answers to real questions. "Not one thing," he said. "Not leaving the Hennessy Ranch," she said. "Not settling." "I did not settle," he said with a quietness that was very distinct from indifference. "I arrived." She looked at him. The evening light was on his face, the same face she had been looking at for 7 years now, older and more weathered and fully known, every line and angle of it as familiar as her own hands, as the layout of the pastures, as the particular blue pitcher on the kitchen table. She reached across and took his hand, the way she had taken it at the fire on the trail to San Marcos and the way she had been taking it since, and he held it with the same firm gentleness that was entirely him, and the whippoorwill started in the cedar down by the creek. "I had such a simple plan," she said. "It was a good plan," he said. "It had a flaw." "What flaw?" She glanced at him sidelong, the way she had learned from him, the not-quite smile. "The man I asked forgot to stop." He turned to look at her, and the full smile was there, both corners, the one she prized. "I didn't forget," he said. "I just decided not to." She laughed, and it came out the way it had that first Thursday in the market with the Indian paintbrush. A genuine laugh, unplanned and perfectly timed, and he watched her with those dark eyes full of everything she knew he felt, and the evening was enormous and quiet around them, and the children's voices were still coming through the window, and the whippoorwill was calling, and the Texas sky was going through its evening performance of color with the usual excessiveness. "Charles Bristol," she said, when the laugh had settled. "Clara Bristol," he said. "I love you," she said. "I love you," he said. "I have been trying to think of a more original way to say it, and I keep coming back to those 3 words." "Those 3 words will do," she said. He raised her hand and pressed his lips to the back of it, which he had done since the porch the night he told her he was not pretending, the same quiet gesture that had felt exactly right then and felt exactly right now, unchanged by time in the way that the best things are unchanged by it. James's voice rose inside the house to a pitch that indicated the argument with Alina had escalated to a jurisdictional dispute about something physical. Charles started to rise. "Sit," Clara said. "Nance told me to let them work it out themselves more often." He sat back down. "Nance is probably right. She usually is." They sat in the growing dark and listened, and sure enough, within 3 minutes, the volume decreased and was replaced by the sounds of negotiation, which was James's mathematical mind meeting Alina's practical one. And the outcome, when it came, was the sound of 2 children agreeing on something and moving together toward some shared purpose involving what sounded like the kitchen. Robert's voice said, from the same direction, with the serenity of a 4-year-old philosopher, "I told you." Clara pressed her hand over her mouth to keep in the laugh, and Charles made a quiet sound beside her that was definitely a laugh. And the dark came down over the Texas hill country, and the stars came out in their abundant way, and the whippoorwill called 3 notes, and then 4, and then was quiet. And from inside the house there were 3 children, and the small sounds of the life that had grown out of a request made on a Thursday morning to a stranger who had known her father and borrowed a post-hole digger and forgotten to stop courting her. It was, Clara thought, the best flaw she had ever encountered in a plan. It was, Charles thought, the easiest thing he had ever decided not to remember. And the property that had been the Bailey land and was now the Bristol land lay under the October stars, as it had lain under the stars every October before and would lie under the stars every October after, with the cattle on the night pasture, and the horses in the barn and the cedar by the creek dark against the sky, and everything settled and everything right and everything, fully and without reservation, exactly where it was supposed to be.